today, running as a red thread, has been the impact of the invasion of Ukraine and this new era of global power politics, not just on the geopolitical arena per se, but also on the economic era. And that sense that we're moving from a rules-based system into a power-based system, an age of increased confrontation in the economic field as well. And we've already touched in some of our other sessions on what the implications of that might be. So in this session, we want to return to that issue as we talk about the whole question of economic security in an age of confrontation, hopefully looking at those issues of strategic autonomy and where we need to be strategically autonomous. How does the EU ensure it doesn't get itself into the same position again in terms of dependency on others? What is that balance between protecting and protectionism? How do we respond to the US Inflation Reduction Act? How do we respond to developments in China? Lots to discuss. Let me bring our panel up straight away. I'm delighted to welcome here with us in the room, Francesca Bria, President of the Italian National Innovation Fund. Francesca, very warm welcome. Do come and sit with me. Joining us online, yes, there he is. We have Martin Sandbu, European economics commentator at the Financial Times. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today. Again with us in the room, Mariette Schaake, International Policy Director at Stanford University Cyber Policy Center, and Georg Riekeles, EPC Associate Director. Great to have you with us as well. Please do make yourselves comfortable. And I shall begin. Reminds me of a children's story. Let us dive straight in, and I do hope we will have time for some of your questions and comments also during this discussion. But Francesca, perhaps I could come to you first. I mean, as I indicated, this is something that has run through all our conversations today, that this is an era where the old multilateral rules-based system is under severe threat, that we are moving to this power-based system. What do you see as the most important challenges that we, Europe, need to confront if we are to ensure, whether we can ensure economic security? I would have a big question mark whether that's even achievable, but more economic security than would otherwise be the case. How do you see the challenge ahead?
So first of all, good afternoon, everyone. A pleasure to be here in this panel. Yes, so I think the word of the year, according to the Collins Dictionary, is perm crisis. And
it's the EPC word. They coined it first.
EPC word, exactly. And so we this multiple interconnected crisis, I think, first of all, need political leadership, actually, where a lack of political leadership, a lack of ability to look long-term and strategic can put us in a situation where we see structural shortcomings. So we have seen it during the pandemic, of course, with the war, inflation and energy crisis, we see that very clearly. And so this kind of long-term perspective also has to enable us to move beyond the kind of, I mean, let's say Europe has to have the ability to unleash all the instruments that the bloc can use, and to do it, so don't be afraid to use all the instruments that we have and beyond. And I think, of course, the emergency is to do it in a coordinated manner. And we have seen that before. Why? And for me, the kind of real challenges have to do with strategic autonomy when it comes to strategic supply chains, but also our independence at industrial level, at energy level, infrastructure level, and technology. So technology, for example, it's not anymore detangled from the economic and the industrial level. And so, yes, I think we see a possibility of deindustrialization for Europe if we are not able to look globally at the kind of strategic missions that we have. So, so I think we have seen that for example, what are the instruments that we can use?
Let's come back on that if we
yeah.
could. I'd just like to set out the nature of the challenge and the scale of the challenge, and then how do we respond in a little while. But Martin, from your perspective, for you, the major challenges we need to address in this new era of global power politics, I'm going back to the title, I mean, we talk about economic security. As I say, I have a question mark over whether that can be the goal, and if it's not, where do we need to be aiming for?
Thanks, Jackie, and hello, everyone. I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person, especially because all the colleagues on the panel are people I've learned so much from, so I had to look forward to having FaceTime with you as well, but it is what it is. There's so many ways to answer your question, Jackie, but I think I want to answer it in almost a psychological way. I think the greatest challenge is some sort of psychological and political preparedness. I mean, we've seen both with COVID, but also especially with the war, Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the weaponization of energy, that clearly we are economically insecure on the European continent. Europe is never going to be autarkic or self-sufficient in everything. So we will be vulnerable to shocks. So I think the challenge is how to be mentally, psychologically, and therefore politically prepared for that. Two aspects of that. One is, are we prepared? Can we be better prepared to react fast when our vulnerabilities are weaponized against us? So that's the reactive bit. The EU has surprised everyone, I think, with how fast and how united it's managed to be since February 24th. But it's not something we can rely on. We've been lucky and we've had some good political leadership. But I think we need to get to a place where, ahead of any conflict or any insecurity breaking out, we know how to act fast to address it. Because again, we're not going to cut ourselves off from the world. We shouldn't, and we won't. The second aspect is less defensive and more, I would almost say, offensive. But the old saying goes, if you want peace, prepare for war. I think the EU needs to become mentally much more able to basically throw its weight around in the world. We've always had a bit of a Greater Germany symptom of being an economic giant and a political dwarf or geopolitical dwarf. That has to end, I think. Not that Europe will willingly go down that road, but when other power blocks in the world do play a power game rather than a multilateral game, we need to be able to do the same thing. So, you know, a lot of people in the room and at the EPC and elsewhere in Brussels will know and cherish the Brussels effect. Well, let's think about the Brussels effect writ large. Let's be much more active in actually trying to shape the world somewhat in our image, in a more progressive, more 21st century way than the bad chapters in the European past, which we should of course be aware of, and part of the reason why we've been reticent to act in this way. But those are the mental shifts I think we need, both in terms of much more preparedness to be reactive in the most effective way, and actually be out there to try to shape the world so that our vulnerabilities and interdependencies don't get weaponized against us in the first place.
Which comes back to something Herman Van Rompuy said in his opening intervention today about the key to not being doomed to stand by powerless. And he pointing very much to some of those issues you've raised. We'll come back on that, Martin, in a little while, and what throwing your weight around might actually mean in very concrete terms. But Mariette, please continue to build the picture for us in terms of the challenge. And are we moving far enough, fast enough? Is the EU, we've had a theme running through the day of waking up to the scale of the change. In this area, do you think we have woken up to the scale of it?
Well, it's hard to ever say it's enough, right? Because we live in such a difficult time. Nobody's happy. Everybody feels the pressure, whether it's geopolitical, economic, climate-wise. Ivan in the previous session rightfully said, you know, people feel challenged by seeing the world developing in ways that they can't understand. And it's, for example, in part a lot because of the technological revolution. So to say that we are where we should be and that it's enough, I think would not be an appropriate statement. But the fact that there are such major challenges also creates momentum for major action. We see some of that happening. And I think the big question is, how can citizens be brought along? Some of these packages are big. We're talking about billions of euros, hundreds of billions of euros. And the momentum of uncertainty falls in a polarized moment in societies as well, where growing numbers of citizens are already distrustful of authorities and feel like they can't be acting in their own interest, or they must turn to outsiders who seek to challenge the mainstream parties, for example. So to present whichever solutions are there, and we can talk further about it, but I agree with what Francesca said. They should be strategic, they should be integrated, they should be reinforcing each other, they should have global impact, as Martin said. Whatever big solutions are presented, they must also be framed in a way that people understand. And I think that's, you know, when citizens can be convinced that the solutions presented are big, require common resilience, a common effort to move forward, then you can kind of combine the two efforts in a way that hopefully will rebuild that trust and mobilize people along when they understand that this is not something abstract far away from them, dealing with, for example, a war far away or a climate crisis that is not upon us yet, but really that we're meeting the moment now together.
And that raises the question, really linking these big sort of economic throwing your weight around type issues that we're talking about and how the EU does that. But it also links it to our response to the energy crisis, to the cost of living crisis. They all fit together, don't they, Georg? Georg, how do you see the challenge? And do you believe we have woken up to it in this area?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, first of all, I think what we need to do is to realize that the political imperative for Europe has changed, also in economic terms. The current mandate of von der Leyen, the current parliament, they came in with the twin mandate, the twin transition, the green and digital transition. And I think now we've gone from 2 to 3. The real challenge, a fundamental challenge that's been added to the twin transition, the third one, is the transition to economic security. And I'm afraid we haven't fully taken the measure of what that means quite yet. You mentioned in your introduction, Jacki, that we're in a world that's moving from a rules-based relationship to a power-based relationship. And of course, one thinks of Russia, one thinks of China, but I would like to take the example of the US and the example of the Inflation Reduction Act. So it's probably the best climate news we've had in 2022 across the world, and all cheers for that. But at the same time, this Inflation Reduction Act is a return to protectionist policies. Well, it's a combination of subsidies and domestic content requirements that is a complete shock to Europe, and that I think nobody expected. And essentially, what it is a hold-up on Europe's manufacturing base in key areas of European industrial strength and future industries, such as batteries and electric vehicles. If you add to that, obviously, the energy shock, which you mentioned, of course, this is not in any way by the US doing, but the 300 billion euros of windfall profits that American energy companies are making, you can also speak about Norwegian energy companies, that's hundreds of billions of euros sucked right out of Europe's competitiveness. So we can understand very well what Biden needs to do. He needs to heal America. He needs to revive the Rust Belt. But what we are facing in Europe is our own Rust Belt if we're not capable of acting. And so for the time being, what I see is a lot of talk, but that the answers that we are providing are really far below what we need to do. In a sense, we are, in economic terms, I would say, playing fiddle while Europe is burning. There's a lot of attention from the European leadership on Ukraine, but I don't think there's in any scale needed the attention to Europe's economic woes and the industrial challenges ahead.
But just to follow up on that then, if indeed we are locked in this subsidy race, if there is this threat to our competitiveness, to attracting investment to Europe, because also energy costs in the US so much lower, what is the answer? Is the answer, there are those who say, and Herman Van Rompuy talked earlier about how do we protect European interests without falling into real protectionism, but we're seeing calls already from Germany, from France, very powerful voices saying, Now we need to do the same. We need a Buy European Act. That's the road we have to fight fire with fire. That's the road to go down. Others saying it'd be an economic disaster, shrink the economy. Georg, just because you raised this point, for you, what is throwing your weight around, and how far should we go in throwing that weight around? And then I'll come back to you, Martin.
Well, I think we have to look at the concrete cases. If you look at one of Europe's strengths in the past was the chemical industry. We used to be a net exporter. Now we're importing chemicals. When you see what situations European companies in batteries, but also in more traditional manufacturing and industry are facing, if they want to put up, invest in a plant in Europe that costs 400 million euros, they get 15 million of subsidies. The corresponding cost of that plant in the US is 300 million, and they get 150 million subsidies. So at the end, you're comparing 385 million investment cost to 150. Where do you think they go? They're all flocking to the US. So I think, of course, in terms of the response, now we have our Commission vice presidents that are heading to Washington next week. I'm afraid that they will come out with something that looks semi-positive because one has agreed something on a roadmap on AI, something on standards, an early warning mechanism on supply chain gaps. But it falls completely short of what is the big question. But of course, the key element is a domestic response. And I think what we need, with a colleague, Philip Lausberg, we put out an op-ed the other day, which we called Europe's trillion euro question. I think we have no other choice than to look way beyond the RRF and consider what is needed in terms of investment in Europe. I think there are three brackets, so three elements of that. One is what I would call emergency investments, not least in energy infrastructure. We need to put the energy transition on speed, and that means something in terms of wind power, in terms of conversion to hydrogen, CCS. We can take concrete examples. Commission President has proposed a sovereignty fund. We have a huge problem in Europe, not that much in the startup sector, but in scale-ups. If we can't manage to scale up our companies because there's no investment available, we will also lose out in that area in the future. So I think that's also another area where we don't have the capital pools in Europe, where public investment will have to lead the way. Whether this means a Buy European Act, I think that is something where we'll have to, there's a need to look industry by industry or sector by sector, what kind of measures one put in place, building in on projects of common European interest, alliances, etc. So not across the board by European, but I think we have to be capable of thinking very, very differently in this current economic environment.
Thank you, Martin. You raised that issue of the EU showing its might, showing its muscle. What for you is a Buy European Act, a response, a like with like response to the US part of the answer, or not?
No, I think that would be silly. Let me be first negative and then constructive. Competitiveness, I hate the word competitiveness. Competitiveness is something that applies to companies, not to countries, and certainly not to regions. We should talk about productivity. You know, we need the EU to be productive, the European economy to be productive. The EU is structurally a surplus economy. It's only because of energy prices now that the external account is roughly in balance, but traditionally the EU, and especially the Eurozone, has sold a lot more to the outside world than we import from the outside world. So, you know, we're in glass houses here. And the IRA and the electric vehicle subsidies are not going to change the fact that the US is a big net importer and will continue to have a big current account deficit, partly to the benefit of German and other exporters. So all of that is a bit of a silly discussion. Now, it does matter which industries we have, of course, and some of the cutting edge industries, it's strategically important to have a critical mass of them at home. But don't go down the same protectionist route. Georg rightly said that we have sort of a third imperative now on top of the two of digitalization and the green transition that came from 2019. But we're very lucky in that aligns very nicely with the pre-existing priorities. So we're not in a conflict here. We just need to reinforce what we already wanted to do. And in particular, energy independence and the green transition go together very well. I agree with Georg, we could do a lot more on subsidizing ourselves, our own industries in these cutting edge industries, where there are clearly market failures and so on. But if there isn't enough investment in Europe, it's not the US's fault. It's probably not even a lack of subsidies. It's probably more to do with the difficulty of scaling up and really using the single market for what it should be worth. So that agenda has to be kept. We have to keep pushing that. But to your question, Jackie, about throwing our weight around, since I said that, I think the green transition is a great place to throw our weight around. We haven't heard as much about the carbon border tariff, carbon border adjustment mechanism this year as we did last year. It is coming, I'm sure, but this is an excellent way of throwing our weight around, and in fact, to some extent, as a side effect, protecting the EU industries that want to make the green shift themselves, because at least they will not be undercut by those who have cheap fossil energy elsewhere. We should own up to the fact that the EU is very poor in fossil resources. We can be quite well endowed in renewable resources if we do the right things. So we should focus on industries that are, that don't use energy intensively. If we have to import some chemicals or fertilizer of ammonia, I don't think that's a big problem.
It's about playing.
But let's focus on getting more of that renewable energy.
It's about playing to our strengths.
Play to our strengths.
Not about shutting others out. Would you agree with
that?
Well,
shutting our others out in the sense that they're not with the program on the green transition. And let's collaborate with the US on this.
Thank you, Francesca.
Yes, I would. And I think what I like about the Inflation Reduction Act, again, is that it is ambitious and it is long-term. So I wouldn't only see it in terms of protectionism. I want to see it in terms of, okay, Europe, what we didn't do that well until now. I think, for example, we didn't do that well integrated proactive industrial policy. It's true, we were strongly dependent from Russia when it comes to energy, and we reduced it to 25% now. We have to diversify. We have a fantastic Green Deal, which, yes, I think it's the place where we have to mobilize our ambitions and also get citizens and communities along. But we did lose on platform-based digitization. We actually don't have any tech champions, any deep tech champions in Europe. It's very hard. At the moment, we have Elon Musk governing data.
That is?
Well, because we didn't have a proactive industrial policy. We were protecting the incumbents much more than setting the stage for the scale-ups in strategic value chains of the future. And this, we have to do it in, I think, building a low carbon supply chain and green innovation value chain, because also there, what it was said about new dependencies that will replace all dependencies, it's a big risk when it comes to the energy, the clean energy industry. Well, we see already everything is happening in China, and we are dependent when it comes to raw materials and critical materials and rare earth from Asia. Also microchips, it was said, batteries, our capacity to build them here. So there I see a big opportunity, but we have to do a proactive, coordinated industrial strategy with massive investments. And there I would see a mix of subsidies, a mix of blending finance, faster decision-making, and yes, mobilizing all the capacity and the muscles that we have. And I think we need more imagination, more capacity to act. And what I don't like, if I may say, because I don't have so much a problem with the ambitions of the Inflation Reduction Act, what I think it can be a problem is the banning of Chinese technology, the decoupling so strong of the global technology chain. That I think is worrying, because also, banning the microchip technology, but also the equipment to produce advanced microchip, that is a challenge for Europe. And that I don't think, I think we have to be global leader for the green innovation of the future. Work with Latin America, work with Africa, so we have to be more strategic, and that I think it's a big challenge to decouple so strongly when it comes to critical components like advanced microchips.
And I want to come back on that question of new dependencies and old dependencies, and where the dependencies of the future may come from. But Mariette, just to this conversation about how, I'm very interested, because if I interpret Francesca correctly, she's almost saying the Inflation Reduction Act is a welcome thing because it should spur us into action. How do you think the EU should respond to this?
Well, what's remarkable, if I wouldn't listen, in great detail, but just the bigger picture, I would hear points that were made 10, 15, 20 years ago. A stronger geopolitical Europe, stronger investment for scale-ups, a digital single market, a single market, an energy union. These are in many ways plans that have been around and have probably been taken up too slowly. So we have to ask ourselves, what is different now? And I think one critical issue that's different now and that presents a particular challenge for the European Union is the extent to which other big global players justify their interventions in the economy from a national security point of view. So, for example, the United States, which has traditionally not been protectionist and quite open, in fact, is now legitimizing interventions in the economy from a national security point of view, export controls, for example, banning of certain technology, not from an economic justification, but from a national security one. And this is where Europe has a particular challenge. So we can think about how it needs to operate more strategically from an economic vantage point, but also from a geopolitical power vantage point, and how these are interconnected. And this is where I think that the links are too weak in Europe at the moment. Because sure, we can talk about how we need to mitigate inflation and challenges for our economic growth, but there is a big link to, for example, do we have the technologies that we need? Can we get access to them? And what does it mean to our national security? Can we build a digital single market, keep our talent here, get investments into new companies, which will be good for growth, for employment, and so on, but do it in a way that actually fosters our position in a changing world. And for that, there also needs to be a recognition by political leaders. And again, I think this is a matter of political leadership, that staying so clung to having national security as a national competence, divorcing it entirely from the single market, for example, or for Europe on the global stage, is going to shoot itself in the foot. And I haven't really seen that recognition yet. I mean, obviously, all the energy challenges now are related to geopolitical challenges, but they do not force a breakthrough when it comes to a more federal approach to our strategic position in the world, for example.
So when it comes, Georg, to that issue of our strategic position, when it comes to the whole issue of strategic autonomy, and I'm not going to use the word open with it because I think it's slightly ambiguous and therefore meaningless. Do you think when it comes to those vulnerabilities, are we focusing, some of you have mentioned some of the areas where we have the vulnerabilities, but we also heard Francesca talking about the potential for new dependencies. Where do you believe the EU's focus should be? And Martin said earlier, we're never going to be self-sufficient in everything. So if we can't do it all, where do we need to focus? Where can we be? Question to you, Georg, and then back to Martin, and then to the others.
Well, first of all, on strategic autonomy, I think we have wasted way too much time debating it. Now one talks about open strategic autonomy, which I think should be totally uncontroversial. The way it's been defined, it means that we do with others what we can. And I think it's a very important point that's being made by Martin and others, that we have an interest in an open economy. But it also means open strategic autonomy, that we do for ourselves what we need to do for ourselves. And sort of reacting to some of the previous points that have been made, I think we are talking in far too self-congratulatory terms about the Green Deal. I don't think we are that much in a position of leadership as we would like. I don't think we are necessarily that much ahead, say, of China when it comes to hydrogen technologies. I don't think we are in a better position of scaling up new innovations in technological innovations, even in green tech. If you look at the figures again, we represent 22% of the world's investment in clean tech when it comes to startups, but only 9% when it comes to scale-ups. So growing scale out of it, whereas the US represents 49%. So I think we will have very fundamental challenges ahead of us, even in the sectors where we think we are leading. And then, of course, used to ask about the future. The future is always a very complex question. But I think, obviously, everything that has to do with ITC, with new technologies, such as quantum, for instance, is also another area where we'll be facing those same challenges. We have, it's an area we've been working a little bit on at the EPC. We have a formidable fabric of research, of innovation, and of startup ecosystems in Europe in the area of quantum computing, which will be absolutely key tomorrow. But we don't have, for the time being, the capacity to grow that. I think a lot comes down, and I agree with Mariette. We've been saying it for years, and it's part of the origin of the productivity problems we have today. But we have a problem with investment in Europe. So that is definitely something that that needs to be solved. But of course, at the same time, we're in a situation now where one problem doesn't come alone. Raw materials, if we want to talk about our strategic dependencies and the link between security and the economy, that's another area where we need to think about the situation we're in. And I think Europe is strategically unprepared to meet the metals needs of tomorrow. China is prepared. They've been preparing for this for decades. So all again, sorry for being a bit pessimistic here on this, but I think the picture is more bleak than we would like to think, even in the area of say the green transition. Yeah.
Martin, you made the point earlier about we can't be self-sufficient in everything, and we don't want to shut ourselves off from the world. Where would you focus? Where do you think, and to Georg's point about, we like to say we're doing terribly well in a number of key areas, but a big question mark over the degree to which, in some areas, we've already lost the technology race. How do you assess our performance now, and where would you be putting the focus on in this strategic autonomy debate?
No, I agree with Georg that things aren't as good as they should be. I tend to look more at how are we doing compared to where we ought to be, rather than where are we compared to other economic regions. Sometimes it can be a bit of a distraction to think of everything in terms of a race rather than a race against ourselves and kind of pushing up our own standards. I also agree with Mariette that many of these things we're talking about, we have been saying for 10, 20 years. That doesn't make them less important, of course. If anything, it makes them more important. We still have to do all these things. We should have done energy union 10 years ago. We should have started really building a digital single market 15, 20 years ago, and so on. I worry about two things, two or three things, just to get concrete. So one is in terms of the digital space. I worry that we are building the networks or the platforms, or using networks, physical networks and digital platforms of the future in ways that make us vulnerable to weaponization by others. So this is, the Huawei story writ large, if you like, the worry that hardware or software developed outside of Europe can be used against us in a conflict situation. It's something we become more aware of, but need to take much more seriously in terms of policies. Second, I worry a little bit less about how, okay, we don't produce enough rare earths here and so on. Rare earths aren't actually that rare. We just have to actually start looking for them. They can be processed in many places. That's not so complicated. We just kind of have to do it. But what I worry more about is whether we have a proper policy for how we structure the way our economies function. And here again, go back to the Belt and Road project by China. Again, this is something we've been worried about for a while, but the whole point of that project was to build trade networks, production networks that focus all economic activity on a sort of Sino-centric model. This was the reason to worry about Piraeus. This was the reason to worry about Hamburg port, even if in the event, I don't think that was a big deal, but it's the strategic implication of a foreign power being able to structure relationships in our economy. How do we answer that? Well, by a whole lot more investment and a willingness to shape the structure of our economy ourselves. That can mean transport, it can mean energy, it can mean digital networks, but it takes, first of all, some sort of guiding intelligence at the European level, which requires agreement and less jealousy of national powers at the national level. And it requires a lot more money, as Georg has been saying. I think it was the Vienna Institute for Economics that had some proposal a year or two ago on how we should tie in Southeastern Europe with much more transport network suited to green mobility, of course. They said, this is on the order of 1 trillion, 2 trillion investment we have to think about over a number of years, obviously. But that's the scale we should be thinking about. Trillions, not billions.
Thank you very much. Mariette, just coming back to you on that point about digital security. And one question that occurs here is, we have seen dramatically how our energy dependency has become such a huge weakness that we need to address. Are you concerned that in the future we may face a similar situation when it comes to issues around security? But more broadly, going back to your point about we've been having these conversations for years, and I indeed have been moderating conversations like this for many years. If it's so evident and so obvious what we need to do, and somebody said earlier, the green transition, the digital transition, you know, it's a win-win. And I'm borrowing here from Fabian Zulig, the chief executive of the EPC, who in a discussion yesterday said, well, if it's so obvious, why aren't we doing it? What is holding us back from doing what we so self-evidently need to do? That specific point, if you would, on digital, but more broadly, what do you believe is holding us back? And how do we make sure that we're not having this conversation in another 10 years' time when we've fallen even further behind?
Right. So I think what Martin said is he likes to look more at what's necessary rather than how Europe compares to, let's say, US and China, which is kind of a popular comparison game. I think one of the reasons why we are where we are is that on the EU level and between the leaders of different member states, there's a tendency to look at how far they've come compared to where they were and how much has been achieved to overcome differences between the member states. And obviously, we all know here in Brussels how hard that is and how much energy it takes, but it doesn't mean it's enough. And if you ask why we don't have a proper functioning digital single market, for example, why we haven't been able to offer our incredible talent more opportunities, then that is what explains. It's because almost every member state still believes that they can have one center of excellence where they educate people technologically, or they can have quote unquote national champions, you know, when it comes to this industrial policy, which, by the way, the arguments we've also heard coming back over and over again. We didn't really quite need the crisis that we're in right now to hear the same voices often saying, hey, industrial policy is the answer. So it is a tendency to look at what's in it for me by national governments, and only then, if that equation is okay, to support action on the European level. Now, what I hope the momentum and the challenging moment we're in can achieve is that the perspective changes, is that we're actually forced to look outward from you know, our own sort of comparative mode between the member states, that we see the enormous pressures coming upon this part of the world, all the values that we have fought for over the decades, our way of life, as was mentioned earlier today, is something I think Tarek mentioned it, uniquely European. And I do think those are all under pressure. And so perhaps with a perspective change, more political will, because that's what a lot of this boils down to, a political will to put that point on the horizon and to bring people along.
But is your answer to Francesca's point about our lack of tech companies in the top 10, that we are too focused on national champions, we are too focused, we are not getting that scale of coming together at the European level? And then I'll come to you, Francesca.
Well, we have been, obviously, and there's now an overemphasis on regulation. And, you know, people who know the things I care about, I'm a supporter of regulation, but it's not the only thing. You also need growth, you also need talent attraction, you also need investment. And if you only look at one part, which is to regulate American, Chinese, and other companies, then you're missing a lot of the points. And to come back to your first question, and then I'll end, but, you know, have we done what we could with regard to digital in terms of security? I think the underlying challenge that we're discussing here is the threats to the multilateral system, to a rules-based order, respect for international law, and so on. And when you look at the whole digital infrastructure, and the way we prevent, but also deal with cyber attacks when they've happened, the way we are supposed to deal with resiliency, essentially, it has not clearly been articulated how all these new technologies are supposed to fit within international law, our rules-based order, and therefore we see attacks happening without consequence. Yeah. We see the undermining with, for example, disinformation of our democracies, which blends in with cyber attacks, and our opponents, those who seek to undermine our way of life and everything we cherish in terms of freedoms and rights protections here, being successful because there is no threshold. So we may all feel in our gut that this is not what we want, but we have nowhere to go to seek accountability. And so there's a lot of work to be done there. And I think if that's an opportunity for Europe, which has this strong regulatory emphasis, to turn it internationally as well, but really to get to results and not just principles and so on.
And Francesca, I've lost count of how many debates I have moderated over the last decade about creating that environment that really fosters innovation, that really drives the investments that we need. What do you believe, going back to the point about if it's so self-evident that it's in our own interest, what do you believe is holding us back?
Well, a part is what just Marietje said, that Europe has focused so much on being this super regulator of the digital age. We've done it pretty well, and I think the Brussels effect is happening when it comes to data regulation, data portability, AI regulation, the GDPR, and antitrust. I mean, we have done things well, but we didn't put enough focus in, I think, investing when it comes to infrastructure, innovation, and when it comes to compete actually on a technology and scientific level. I mean, that's where we didn't do it. We didn't have, maybe what Martin said, for me, it's very important. Europe doesn't really have a European strategic brain that acts pragmatically. I mean, we still actually are in an endless national government negotiation. And when it comes to, maybe now we're better at unleashing the investment because of the Next Generation EU, because of a semi-industrial policy that is shaping up, because of the European Interest Strategic Project, the alliances, and so on. But how this will be delivered, what's going to happen on the ground, in cities, in regions, in where citizens are. And I think that's, for me, the big challenge for Europe in the future, that we still have the nationalists, which are gaining traction, and a view that says this is going to be a Europe of nations. And we have a lot of disenfranchised citizens that don't believe that there is anything that's not the day-to-day, like we want to, of course, decrease the price of energy tomorrow because of the bills, because of the life of the citizens. But what's our image for the future? We don't know. We are a bit blind. We don't project a vision for the future. And so how do we mobilize people? What are the scenarios? For me, there it's where Europe could do it differently, because we have a different approach. For example, the cities. How do we decarbonize cities? What does it mean to have a greener cities, a better mobility, fight climate change, embrace the movement of the young people asking for decarbonation and net zero? What does it mean to do it with workers' rights, paying taxes at home, redistributing wealth, creating good jobs and not precarious gig economy labor? That's where Europe has its strengths for me. At the end, it's the societal model. And I know it seems a bit like, yeah, you're going around saying this societal model of Europe, but that's what we have. I mean, we have the sustainability, autonomy, democracy, the environment, better workers' rights. Are we able to create a vision for the future where this is practical, it's pragmatic, people are coming with us, and we do it within the current, of course, global order? I think it's a big question, but it goes even beyond innovation, because innovation should follow this vision. It shouldn't just happen to innovate. I mean, actually, with quantum.
Innovate for what?
Innovate for what? Because quantum, we are leading in hybrid supercomputing and quantum. But how do we want all this computing capacity to do what? That's where the missions are critical.
Quick reaction from Martin and from Georg, and then I'm going to come out to all of you. And Just, I'm going to ask you to ask the question you asked this morning that I postponed. But Martin.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I just want to re-emphasize this point about scale. The US has anyone who has a good idea in the US knows that they can almost immediately scale up to a domestic market of 300 million, more than 300 million now. That's been an advantage for the US for 100 years, so much so that they don't really even have to think about it. China has an enormous domestic market and have been thinking about it and realizing very self-consciously that scale, using that scale is something that promotes not ideas. Everyone has ideas, but actually commercializing them and making them into products that spread. The EU has the scale in principle, but we have been we're not conscious enough of the how much scale can benefit us. And so the result is that a bright person, young man or woman with some excellent entrepreneurial idea, of which there are many in Europe, and they probably have ideas that are better suited as solutions for European problems and European preferences, goes a bit to what Francesca was saying, what is it for? But they don't have that confidence or belief at all that if they manage to implement some good idea, they can immediately then scale up to selling to 500 million people. That is crucial. Now, how do you address that? Some of it is cultural, some of it is psychological, a lot of it is regulatory. We shouldn't set up regulation as a sort of something you trade off against investment or other things. Regulation can be helpful here insofar as it harmonizes and makes for one single market. So I keep harping on about that. But I think we're not really appreciating enough what we, the potential we have there. But we really need to not ask people like me, but the people who are down there, the 20-year-olds with the ideas, what would it take for you to feel that this idea is something I can very quickly sell to 500 million people?
Thank you. And we keep coming back, Georg, to this issue of fragmentation, which lies at the heart of all of this. What for you is the key here?
Well, I think Martin is saying something fundamental. We have scale in principle, but I think we should be, one, very aware that it's eroding, and two, very often that we don't have it in practice. And obviously, this is about the single market. The single market is not where it should be. You can think about the services economy, for instance, but I want to take a sort of a more recent example, the CHIPS Act. So, I had two issues with the European CHIPS Act. I believe in open international economies, in Ricardo, and division of labor, and specialization, etc. We have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to achieve with our strategic autonomy? Is it from national security perspectives? Is it tech competitiveness, or is it some form of security of supply for the wider industry? I'm not so sure that in semiconductors, it's a wise choice for Europe to say we're going to put everything in to try to be able to do the 2 nanometer product in Europe, when you see the scale of investments needed. If our concern is security of supply for our car industry, which requires something like 25 or between 25 and 60 nanometers. So that's one question about where we're putting our money and what's key for us, and whether we can indeed insert ourselves in an international open economy and at least an open transatlantic space. But I think there's also a story in the CHIPS Act about the single market, because when they're having discussions now in Council and in the European Parliament about the CHIPS Act and where the money is going to go, it's all about fair returns. Everybody, every member state and every national or European parliamentarian are thinking, well, what's coming back to my country, to my member state? And of course, it can't work like that. And even before the CHIPS Act, or in parallel, we have examples of this. You have a number of member states in the famed RRF, where there's billions and billions available, that said, we'll invest in semiconductors. And what is happening when they're trying to spend this money now? Well, they can't, because you can't just say we want to have semiconductors. I'm not going to cite any specific member states, but in every corner of Europe, because you need some critical scale, you need the research capacity, you need the skills, etc., etc. So this is, I think, a fundamental problem that we have in Europe. We think we have the single market, but we still each think, what's in it for me? What can I get out of it?
I'm also wondering, we've talked a lot over the years when we talk about regional policy about smart specialization.
Absolutely, regional
but
policy.
Are we being smart on a European scale as well as at a regional level? A quick one, Mariette, because I want to go out to the room.
Yes, no, I just wanted to build on the last points that were made, is that, one could easily get the impression that there are pots of money that can be brought home. But what politicians really need to do also is tell the honest story. There will be difficult times ahead, and explain what they're going to be doing for people. But it would be an illusion to only talk about what's going to be great, what we're going to bring home, because people are not crazy. They understand that there are what, pen crises or whatever the word was, polycrisis, yes. And so I think it's important to do both, but really to bring people along also when there's bad news, because this whole illusion that we're going to continue to grow, that there's going to be continuing money coming back from Brussels, and even for this more integrated Europe that's going to be capable to act on a global scale, there needs to be a notion of it being worth investing in the sort of weaker links of the union. And that requires political leadership because people do not want to do it out of their, well, generally do not want to do it out of their own goodwill. It requires explaining how money is being made when the poorly performing economic areas are lifted up through infrastructure or investments and so on. And that story I don't hear enough of.
And interesting, I mean, you're linking to something that was said in our discussion on global trends this morning, when Suhasini Haidar talked about learning to live with less and be happy about it. And Herman Van Rompuy has talked many times in debates I have moderated with him about Europe's relative position economically in the world will decline. But that's not necessarily a bad thing because it means others are growing. So a change in our understanding of the balance. Hold that thought, because I just want to go out into the room and see if we can lure anyone into this conversation. And just, I promised you, Fabian wants to, but did you want to come back on your Boeing question? Let me come to you first, then I'll come to Fabian, promise. And we are on. Got you.
Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion. I must say, I'm Joost van Iersel from The Hague, and I fully agree with all the fears that we are, in the end, be left aside. And why? Because there is that fragmentation, and that is fundamental. Now, in the past, we have had that project, Airbus. That was a multinational project. It was realized because we could not accept that only Boeing dominated the world. Okay. It became a tremendous success. Ariane was also a multinational operation. And nowadays, the French and the Germans are not even able to make a concept for a common tank, let alone a common aircraft. Okay, so what conditions have to be fulfilled? And at short notice, we have not that much time, yeah, to change that.
Thank you very much.
Where is that leadership?
Thank you very much. Fabian.
Thanks very much. Fascinating discussion. I wanted to come back to what Jacki mentioned, is if it's so obvious, why are we not doing it? And maybe to suggest that the reason why we are not doing it is because rather than facing a situation of win-win, we're facing a situation where there are real trade-offs, real costs, both in economic terms and in political terms. In economic terms, we're facing a situation where some of these measures will, for example, increase inflation, will decrease growth, will make it difficult also between the different objectives we have. Some of the things we're doing, for example, in economic security, might well be countering what we're trying to do in climate change, as we're seeing at the moment in terms of the supplies we're getting in. So unless we are facing these real choices, these real trade-offs, and we're being honest with people what the priorities are, we're not going to make progress because we're pretending we can achieve everything at the same time. And behind all this is the competition for the investment. There's an enormous amount of investment which is needed, and we're not going to be able to invest in everything simultaneously. And on the political level, I think it's even worse, because we are talking here about the only logical step is to do this together at the European level. And that means giving up power, giving up money to the European level. And it also means that we have to be able to implement a European compromise, despite the fact that the individual member state interests are very different.
Thank you very much. Let us come back. That is a very big question. To the specific, Francesca, of your question about the Airbuses of this world, and then to the broader question, all of you.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be able to formulate the question better because I am asking this question every day. And I can actually make an example, which is so much more simple, and I still cannot understand why we're not doing that. Think about the social media, because we were in this social media for a long time. We do have an actual problem now on Twitter, and we have a problem with not having reliable digital tools that are secure, that protect our data, that protect us against disinformation, and that enable a robust digital public sphere, which I think is very important for everything we're talking about. Well, why isn't Europe able to, for example, invest 300 million per year on Mastodon, which is an alternative to Twitter, and is today open source, and we could actually do it? Why we don't do it? I don't have an answer, because I've been working so many years on this and try to do it. And I think it's because we lack, it was said a little bit almost like we lack the imagination, the capacity to believe we can do it, and then the brain and the power. But the investment, yes, in the scale-up scene, it's true, we don't have enough, we can invest more, but it's almost like now we do have investment. We actually do have investment, so what's block us to do it? And I think in terms of competition amongst nation states, it has been very strong when it comes to the previous wave of industrial innovation. I think now we have to do it more European because of the scale, because of the massive investment needed, and because of the capacity and capabilities. I think we lost a lot of capabilities, and even more systemic capacity between the public sector and the private sector to do it. So we have lost that capabilities, and I think the capabilities we have to take it back.
Thank you. Mariette, and then Martin, reacting on this point Fabian was making about trade-offs, if you would.
Sure, yeah, well, I think it links to what I've said before about telling the honest story, but I also wanted to pick up on the notion of European growth being relative in worldwide context. One, of course, if you're an exporting economy, you benefit from the growth of others. In fact, you depend on it. But the notion of relative growth, I think, in families is problematic, because since World War II, roughly speaking, every generation has been better off than the previous one. And that point is now tipping, and that is leading to discomfort and perhaps conservatism, a lack of will to be open to this new imagination, because there's a tendency, very understandable human one, to cling to what one has. It probably also explains why there is more conservative politics at this moment in time, and that the parties who've always said that we need change, we're optimistic about the future, you can hear the mottos resonating, are facing a challenge, because actually the preservation of our quality of life would be an achievement in and of itself. And that is something different from the big dreams that we might have had in the past, when this relative growth on the level of families was still very steady. But I do think that there's a way to actually speak about these trade-offs. I think we see it with sustainability and the greening of the economy. People are willing to pay a little bit more to have cleaner air, for example. So when you think, or to have better health. So when you think about the quality of life and frame it as such, and not only in terms of growth in the pure economic sense, then I do think you can hopefully get people along. And then obviously the fact that there's a fierce debate and real trade-offs is an integral part of how we do democracy every day. And so that should not surprise us. We should just have people standing for something, saying what they want to do, and then also defend the compromise, whether it be domestically or on the European level.
Thank you, Martin. To this point about trade-offs, but also to the point which Fabian made about real choices, and I think it links to what Georg was saying when he talked about semiconductors and quantum, where you do it and where your strengths are and where they're not. A reaction to that, if you would, and then I would like to put you all on the spot before we close.
Yeah, I think it's a tempting thought to be a bit fatalistic about trade-offs, but why don't we have more investments than we have? It's partly because we buy into the trade-offs a bit too much, perhaps. But by that I mean that when things are hard, we look for places to cut because we need to cut, because we think about austerity and fiscal responsibility and so on. And it just so happens that people you spend money on today scream much louder when you cut it than people you spend money on in the future, which is what investment is. So future businesses that have been created yet and future generations, they don't shout when you try to take money away from them. So that's a problem. I actually think that politically it should be possible to sell a program of higher investment. You need to say, well, as nations, as economies, we will consume a bit less today, invest a bit more, but this leads to growth. And I actually think people quite like when they see flashy new infrastructure in the place they live. They are happy when they see the new electric vehicle charging posts coming up. They're happy when things work better, right? So there's a way of selling this but it comes back to political leadership. I was going to say also, but I think we're running out of time. In addition to investment, there are a lot of things we can do better that don't cost money. So I have a couple of examples, but I'll hand it back to you.
Give me
Jacki,
one
because I think
quick
you're
one. Go on.
very okay. Look, let me do one that we haven't touched on at all, but I think is fundamentally important. The European Central Bank is in the forefront in developing a central bank digital currency. We haven't talked about it at all when we talk about technological innovation. It's often seen, it's partly a reaction to, avoiding Facebook or Elon Musk or whatever running our payment system. That's a good reason. An even better reason is to think of it as industrial policy. If the euro gets a proper digital currency, we suddenly create an ecosystem for central bank-backed smart contract development, payment services developments we haven't even imagined yet. I think it's the sort of thing that it doesn't cost any money, but suddenly there's a new world there that smart people can then start building on.
And a quick one to you, Georg, in terms of things that do cost money. You mentioned at the beginning the European Sovereignty Fund, the new European fund. So how should we use it most effectively? It'll have to be a quick one, I'm sorry.
Well, I think we all agree that a problem we have with productivity is linked to investment. And of course, investment is very much about making choices. We've spoken about the need for scale-ups. I think a sovereignty fund should notably be used towards taking equity stakes in some industries where we see potential for future. Of course, there might be losses involved, there might be big wins involved, but I think that could be a signal in the context of a different economic environment that Europe is taking seriously some sectors and is willing to put money behind it. But I fully agree with what the question was posed by Fabian. All this is very much about choices, and it's about the capacity to take the choices at the European level. And I think we had a very dynamic period in the European construct between 1990 and 2000 with the euro, with the enlargement, with the Maastricht and security and defense, etc. And what I think the decade we're in now will require similar, not the same, but similar steps forward in terms of European integration. With RRF, we had a one-off step towards fiscal federalism. I think really now, if we want to solve some of these problems we have, also the international dimension, if we want to be credible, the global gateways, we will need much more firepower at the European level.
Very quickly, because we are almost out of time, and I know Mariette has a train to catch, so I don't want to run late. But for each of you, and I'll start with you, Francesca, then go to Martin, Georg, and the last word to Mariette. Of all the things we've talked about in the last hour, and I'm not going to say a top priority because there are many, many issues, but a key next step. Where do we need to go from here if we are to meet this challenge, if we are to deliver this greater economic security, and I'm going to put it that way rather than economic security per se, in this age of confrontation? Key thing for each of you, half a minute each. Francesca.
Can I first say something to Martin, because he mentioned the central bank-backed digital currency and the digital euro. And actually, Europe could be leading there because of the digital ID with cryptographic digital ID that we are developing and that we can unroll. We have data spaces that are privacy preserving and data portability and all the standards for people to control data. And on top of that, we can have digital payments. I mean, this would be a key underlying infrastructure for the future on top of which experiment new things. And so I totally agree on that. And I think
and your key next step?
Industrial policy. So my next step I want to take, because I'm sure the others will say, for me, is this delivery capacity. That's where I think we should do now. Because of the Next Generation EU, because of all the funding we are unleashing, how do we put it on the ground and where? And how we deliver to citizens. So this capacity to things, to experiment new things, which is about doing innovation. Because innovation, you don't just fund things, you have to experiment, you have to try things, and then you have to unleash it from the lab to the industry to society. And that's where let's use our network of cities to decarbonize, to change waste, mobility, climate.
Thank you.
And get citizens to participate.
Martin, in half a minute, your key next step. Oh, we've lost your sound suddenly, Martin.
Sorry, can you hear me?
There we are, you're back.
I've already sort of plugged my CBDC idea, so on substance, I'll just leave it at that. But I think there's something about, delivery and how we do things. I'll just re-emphasize this idea of some central guiding strategic brain or guiding intelligence at the European level. We really need that. Lots of aspects of that. Georg has undersold his work. He had some great work recently about how in the Brexit negotiations, we managed to have a guiding intelligence, good communication, member states on board, commission leading. We could copy something like that.
Okay.
I think the fiscal rules are promising. There's room in the new proposals to actually use in a slightly diabolical way the punishment of the rules to say, look, if you do things at a common European level and invest a lot, we'll give you a much easier time. I'd like the Commission to use that for everything it's worth.
And Martin, you've broken my hope for the day. I was hoping we could get through an entire conference without mentioning the B word, but it had to come at some point. Georg.
Well, the first point is maybe a response to what Fabian said about making choices. Concrete example, State of the Union this September, von der Leyen says, well, we need a package for SMEs. And I think SMEs were really very much at stake, direct commerce, small businesses in the pandemic, and they needed life support. I think we're in a completely different crisis now. And I think what one needs to focus on, for instance, is this forgotten middle in Europe's economy, which are the mid-caps between the SMEs and the biggest companies, which are very much the segment of Europe's economy that are at the hard edge of this economic security debate in terms of their international exposure, capacity of take up advanced technologies, etc. But of course, the bigger picture I wanted to leave you with, from my part at least, is this issue of bigger federal fiscal capacity. If you look at the US history, when Woodrow Wilson took the US into the First World War in 1917, he created a wartime economy with a lot of agencies dealing with fuel, dealing with technology, etc. And that needed a federal budget to go with it. Hoover, public works in the recession. We don't have the time to go through. Roosevelt, in the context of the New Deal. All this participated creating the US that we have today. And I think very much we're in a moment now in Europe where we're facing similarly big challenges, but I'm not sure that we have completely understood that means a leap also in what we do together at Europe.
Thank you very much indeed. And sorry to hurry you, but I know Mariette has to leave us and she has the last word. So
it's going to be extremely short. So we don't need Buy Europe, but we need a massive investment in democracy defending technologies. And that marries investment in technology, sparking that whole ecosystem and strengthening Europe's role as a geopolitical player. One idea.
Lots to discuss at future conferences. Ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our panel for a wonderful discussion? Thank you, Martin. Very good to see you, sir. Thank you so much for being with us. Francesca, Mariette, fantastic. We're going to take a 30-minute break now. In fact, no, 25 minutes. I lie. 25 minutes. And then we're going to come back and talk about the role of civil society in the perma crisis and its influence on policymaking. And then we will have a keynote speech from Executive Vice President of the Commission, Frans Timmermans. So grab a coffee and I'll see you back here in 25 minutes. Thank you.